We return to our introduction of our new book in our new series, the book of Hebrews, New Priesthood, New Hope, New Covenant. Previously, what we covered, and we didn't get very far, but I'll review it. We talked about the relevance of Hebrews to the modern reader because it's confusing, but nonetheless it reveals Jesus. It provides a great antidote for those who are worried about the security of their salvation. It gives very explicit instructions, clear instructions for the Messianic movement theologically and practically. It addresses the anxiety of believers experiencing persecution or about to experience persecution, and it addresses the challenge of discipleship. So the book of Hebrews, extraordinarily relevant to the modern reader. We talked about the authorship, internal evidence, and there is external evidence. The internal evidence we have regarding the authorship, his superior use of Greek, his familiarity with all things Jewish. This didn't come from a book. And master of ancient Greco-Roman rhetorical style, extraordinary. We looked at the candidates, of which there have been many. These are the top 11: Paul, Clement of Rome, Luke, Barnabas, Priscilla, and Aquila, teamwork. Peter, Jude, Stephen, Philip the deacon, Silas, or John Mark, and Apollos. So many candidates, so little answers. We must conclude that when it comes to the writing of the book of Hebrews, truly, only God knows. Again, if I promised you answers, that is an answer, okay, that I've given you, put you out of your suspense. It's impossible to tell who is the author since it is not specifically signed. These are good candidates. There are reasons to eliminate some of them on their very face, but some of them, unless you had samples of their writing, it would be impossible to make a determination because you have nothing of which to compare. And so you enter the realm of speculation, which is where people like to live. People would much rather ask me, when I teach on the book of Hebrews, they'd much rather ask me, hey, who wrote the book of Hebrews? Then what does the book of Hebrews say and how does it actually impact my life? That's really my concern, and that was the author's concern as well. And other than that is a distraction. Let's talk about the date of composition. I date this book in the middle of the 7th decade of the first century. That would be 63 to 66, somewhere written between 63 and 66. How do I arrive at this? It's really actually, again, it's like forensic science. You look at the parameters, the outer parameters, okay? The earliest it could have been written, the latest it could have been written. The latest, we have the book itself is quoted by Clement, one of the church fathers, in 95 AD. So that puts a very hard stop. And unless it was something that was hot off the press right then, we can definitely assume that it was written earlier than 95 AD. It does mention Timothy as being alive at that time. That's another hard one that ratchets us down to earlier than 82 AD. The temple in Jerusalem functioned until 70 AD, and if the temple had been destroyed by the time of writing, I cannot imagine with the argument that they're making regarding the Messiah establishing a superior priesthood, etc., the superior sacrifice, that would not have made it into the book in mentioning. So that gives us another hard ratchet before 70 AD. On the other end of the time spectrum, the timeline, we perceive from within the text, tells us it's written to a second generation of believers, not the first generation. So it's not written in the 40s or the 50s. So that really locks us into the decade of the 60s. So 60 AD plus to 69 AD. And I believe contextually that 63 to 66 is exactly the time that it was written, because this is the period of time just prior or at the beginning of, it was 66, to the revolution against Rome, the Judean revolution against Rome, which began in 66 AD and resulted in a great amount of suffering for the Jewish people as Rome's power came down hard upon the Jewish people, and arguably consequences from the Lord as well, divine consequences for rejecting his Messiah. So that locks us into a period of time, 63 to 66 AD, regarding the date of composition. Who was this book written to? You know, every aspect of this book, the most basic things, the date of composition, the author, the addressees, everything that can be questioned about this particular book is indeed questions. So there is a categorical lack of agreement as to whom this letter was addressed. We do have some clues, however, but nonetheless, we have some large possibilities, some popular choices. Some would actually say that, remember, the book of Hebrews is not actually in the manuscript itself. So that was appended not that long afterwards, but nonetheless, it was appended after the original writing. So some would say that this was written to Gentile Christians, but not so much. And because a return to Judaism was really no temptation to Gentiles. Plus, in church tradition, there is absolutely no stream of thought thinking that this was written to Gentile Christians, and the title to the Hebrews was given to it back in the 2nd century. So within 100 years after it's being written, if not sooner. All right, so what about the Jewish community in general, the Jewish community in general? No, and non-Christian Jews as well? Absolutely not. There's no way to reconcile some of the arguments if it's written just as an evangelistic tract to Jewish people. It's treating the audience as if they were indeed followers of the Messiah. And that brings us to the most popular, of course, choice, and the one that I think is incontestable, is Jewish Christians. This was written as a letter to Jewish believers in Jesus, and there's several different reasons for that. First of all, the treatment of Jesus, or Yeshua, within the text itself, the treatment of the recipients within the text. They are called holy brethren, holy brothers, beloved, partakers of the heavenly calling, partakers of Messiah. Timothy is our brother. So for a variety of reasons, we see that. We talk about the recipients' faith and belief. They have come to Jesus or come to Yeshua. They have believed. They are exhorted to hold fast to their confession. They are admonished not to throw away their confidence. And the mention that their endurance of persecution was motivated by their faith. And the impending threat of persecution, of course, and the lack of spiritual progress they had made, and not a failure to spiritually begin, but for all the gifts you've been given, in other words, theologically, historically, culturally, why haven't you advanced beyond what you have achieved. And so Hellenistic Jews, and when I say Hellenistic Jews, I mean Jewish people who had been from or grown up in the diaspora in the greater Greco-Roman world, had in the time that we're dealing with, there was heightened hostility to the Jewish people in parts of the Roman Empire, and so they had made their way back to Israel, and specifically to Judea. So the next question that we have to ask ourselves is, what was the destination of this book? I've already given away the goods in my last comment, but the two major locations, and there are many choices of location, as many as people can be creative, but Rome and Judea are the two, and specifically Jerusalem. So is it Rome? Is it Jerusalem that the recipients lived in? And how do you make that determination? You make that determination by the fact that these are people. I reject Rome because they're portrayed as living within proximity to the Levitical process. If they were in Rome, they would be far detached, only making it, at best, 3 times a year during the pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem. And so I reject Rome. That brings us to Jerusalem. I think more than Jerusalem itself, these believers most likely lived in the suburbs or the surrounding areas of Jerusalem, adjacent to Jerusalem, but not in Jerusalem, for a variety of reasons that we will see as the text unfolds. So near to the temple, near to the holy city of Jerusalem, within proximity, but not right on top of it, adjacent to it. So let's then talk about the purpose of the book of Hebrews. Why was Hebrews written? I think it's very clear that it was written to definitively, in other words, with finality, very, very clear, and with clarity, to definitively demonstrate the supremacy of Jesus Christ, the supremacy of Yeshua HaMashiach, in both his identity, who he was as a person, his supremacy as an individual, and in his ministry, his priesthood, in other words. We'll develop the concept in the book of Hebrews that is spoken of nowhere else in the New Testament, but really, really important, the Melchizedekian priesthood, which is very different than the Levitical priesthood. And that's why if you're not really familiar with Hebrews, it's very easy to overlook that really important fact regarding who Yeshua is. So the purpose is to look at the person and the priesthood of Yeshua and to demonstrate definitively his supremacy over what, you may ask. I'm glad you asked, thank you. Over everything. His supremacy over everything. Well, then that brings us from purpose, and it's laid out in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, where it tells us the main point. It's always nice when an author tells us right around the middle of his book and the centerpiece of his book, which is what he does here. He tells us the main point, and what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. With all my respect and appreciation for those who pitched our tabernacle last week, 2 weeks ago, our sukkah, it pales in comparison to the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. So the supremacy of Yeshua's person and priesthood would be the purpose of Hebrews. What is the argument then? It's a rather complicated argument, has a long and winding road, seemingly to get to its point. But when we look at the larger picture and we disseminate all the facts that we can find by studying in depth, in the mining and plumbing the depths of this particular letter, this is what we can see. Chapter by chapter by chapter, it tells us that God's new and superior revelation discloses that with a new and superior permanent priesthood necessarily comes a new and superior permanent law, which yields a new and superior permanent hope by which to relate to God, who provides a new and superior permanent guarantee of a new and superior permanent covenant based upon new and superior promises established through a new and superior sacrifice offered by a new and superior permanent priest within a new and superior sanctuary. So if we look at that again, that's a lot to digest. Just go through that. I want you to think through the process again with me. This is, in 3 slides, this is the book of Hebrews. You're looking at the book of Hebrews. We're walking through it right now, starting with God's new and superior revelation, discloses that with a new and superior permanent priesthood, necessarily comes a new and superior permanent law, which yields a new and superior permanent hope. So far, so good? Okay. Now, that permanent hope is how we relate to God. So a new and superior permanent hope by which we can relate to God. And God himself provides a new and superior permanent guarantee of a new and superior permanent covenant based upon new and superior promises, established through a new and superior sacrifice offered by a new and superior permanent priest. Sacrifice is the priest is the sacrifice, one-stop shopping there, and within a new and superior sacrifice. The motivating force that undergirds the author's passionate defense of the Messiah's superiority is his equally passionate conviction regarding now brace yourself, his conviction regarding the inferiority of the Mosaic covenant and the entire Levitical system. You cannot demonstrate superiority in a vacuum. In order to demonstrate the essential superiority of one thing, it is compulsory to reveal the essential inferiority of another. Nobody gets on television to do an advertisement and says, I have a new and superior product, all new, all improved, in a vacuum. They don't. Even when they're selling vacuums, they don't. They compare them. I mean, the guy selling Dyson does this. They all compare them to products which preceded them and said, this new product is whatever, the cat's pajamas. It is, it's the best ever. And certainly it's 22% better or more effective, or pick your comparative, over the previous product or the competitor's product. In this instance, there's not a competitor's product being compared. It is the first product and now the new product. As for the author of Hebrews, the Mosaic covenant is inferior to the new covenant. Think about it. We'll talk about that as we get through the passages, but just brace yourself for what you're going to hear, because this is what the book says. If the Mosaic covenant was perfect, if it was flawless, if it was without any need left over, why would you ever need an additional covenant? First of all, and it's not even talking about the new covenant as an additional covenant to augment the failings of the Mosaic covenant. It's actually saying that the new covenant, being the superior covenant, is a replacement covenant. Very few of us can drive two cars with one tuchus. Okay? It'd be a challenge. And given the opportunity of driving the old jalopy or the new car that you've recently purchased, which one would you gravitate to? Unless you have really emotional ties to the old jalopy, which I'm not going to inquire about. I don't even need to know why. But the new car is going to win out every time. I much rather drive newer car than an older car, unless, of course, it's a classic vintage, and then it's a different story completely. Well, God's guarantee for the author of Hebrews of the Mosaic covenant is inferior to the guarantee of the new covenant. The promises within the Mosaic covenant are inferior to the promises that are contained with. Every covenant is a basket of promises. That's what a covenant is. It's an agreement, like any contract that you sign with a credit card company or with your lawn service or buying insurance. Every contract you sign is a basket of promises. If you do this, I promise to do this. In the case of the Mosaic covenant, if you follow my law, you will indeed be my special people. That's Exodus 19, that's basic. But the promises that are within the new covenant are not conditional, as are those of the Mosaic covenant. They are unconditional, depending not on our abilities or efforts, but on God's faithfulness itself. The Torah, according to the author of Hebrews, is inferior to the law of Messiah, which makes sense because the Messiah is greater than the Torah, period. Messiah is greater than the temple. Remember, he said, one greater than the temple is here. Read the Gospels. Jesus is continually saying that I am superior to anything. That Moses speaks of me. I'm not the new Moses. I am superior to Moses. There's a whole section in chapter 3 dealing with that. He goes on to state that the Aaronic high priesthood, I mean the high priesthood of Aaron, the Levitical high priesthood, not the Aaronic high priesthood, the Aaronic high priesthood, is inferior to the Melchizedekian high priesthood. There's a whole chapter devoted to that. The Levitical high priests are inferior to the Messiah. I don't think anybody would argue that even the finest of high priests, even the original high priest, Aaron, is inferior to Messiah. The sacrifices in the Levitical system are inferior to the Messiah's sacrifice. Is the Messiah's sacrifice greater than that of bulls and goats? Of course it is. That's basic New Testament theology. The tabernacle and later the temple, inferior to the Messiah's heavenly sanctuary? Of course it is. Temple, tabernacle before that, just a model. Moses was given the blueprints by God of a heavenly reality. The model is always going to be inferior to the actual item. The hope that the Levitical system incites is inferior to the hope incited by our Messiah. The way to God through the Levitical system is inferior to the Messiah's new means of relating to God, of being reconciled to him. The supernatural mediators, those intermediaries between God and man, God and Israel, like Torah and angels, are inferior to the Messiah. In fact, the angels brought the Torah, according to not only Jewish understanding, but also Stephen argued that point, that the angels mediated the Torah to Moses, and Messiah is superior to the angels. Abraham, the Jewish national father, is inferior to the Messiah. Well, if Moses is, then certainly Abraham is. And all prior prophetic revelation is inferior to God's new revelation in his Son. We get 2 verses into Hebrews, and we discover this truth. 2,000 years later, the argument of Hebrews, stunning indictment, and that's what it is. It's an indictment of first century Judaism's inadequacy. In light of Jesus, Yeshua's superiority, still possesses the power to astonish, particularly in a Messianic context. But the author of Hebrews, he never demeans Judaism as a system. Students of Scripture, and that's us, we must always bear in mind that when the author is indicting Judaism, the Mosaic covenant, the Levitical system, it's only germane in comparison to the eminence of the Messiah, the greatness of the Messiah. Nobody belittles the moon for the limited quantity of light it provides in the night sky. When I'm walking around at night in the absence of a brighter, superior heavenly body, I would say the moon does a tremendous job. And when the moon is hidden, its light is sorely missed. But when, in those hours in the morning or the afternoon, when both moon and sun share the same sky and can be directly compared, no one would prefer the moon's output in lumens over the sun's. In the light of day, one heavenly body is so obviously superior to the other that it becomes obvious that while they both emit light, their quality is so different they really cannot be compared. And the author of Hebrews is simply pointing out that the intrinsic glory of God's Messiah is superior to the reflected glory of the Mosaic Levitical system. Intrinsic glory, reflected glory. Well, it's already 12:05. Let's see. We can talk about the structure of the theme very quickly, and then we'll call it a day for now. The book of Hebrews is, on the one hand, do you remember the candy Razzles? Okay, it's a candy, it's a gum. And you could argue all day you want whether it's truly more a candy or more a gum. But at the end of the day, Razzles is both candy and gum. That was the great genius of the confectionery delight called Razzles. For those of you who remember, I remember it well. In the same way, the book of Hebrews is a hybrid. Is it a sermon? Is it a letter? Is it an epistle? Is it a message? It's a hybrid. It's both. Okay, it's both sermon and letter mushed into one in a way that's unique, that you don't really see anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. It is filled with comparisons and metaphor. And what was the metaphor? Metaphor, a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, no. I'll be here all week. Not really. I'm going to close with this graphic representation of Hebrews thematic development. You don't have to go to college to understand this chart, but it helps. If we think of the various different themes, and for example, going up from the bottom, Jesus' supremacy and warnings and faith and new sacrifice and tabernacle and new covenant, new high priest, or Jesus the Son, going up from bottom to top. And then we go across 13 chapters. Then obviously each block of color, whatever the color may be, represents the presence of one of those themes in that chapter. And actually, as you look, and you can see going down, there's very few chapters, 11 and 12 are actually the only chapters that really are dealing with only one theme at a time. Okay? The rest are dealing with multiple themes, but they're in different stages of development. So for example, let's make it easy and let's go to the second one from the bottom, which is a warning. Hebrews is famous for its warning passages. And so every time we see one of those blue areas, the blue crisscrossed areas, we're bringing in the concept of warning, and that will have something to do with the other themes that are going on at the same time. That's why they're brought in when they're brought in. The various different other colors simply reflect the red down on the bottom refers to Jesus' supremacy. That's the main theme of the book. That's why it's in red right there. And you can see the supremacy of Yeshua is actually through and through pretty much the entirety of chapters 1 through half of 10. And then you see a shift where we're dealing with areas of practical issues like faith and encouragement. We take another area like, for example, the concept of the new high priest. That's the number 2 one. The new high priest, it's introduced in chapter 1, right there at the beginning. Jesus as new high priest is introduced in chapter 1. That's the yellow. The theme is advanced in chapters 2 and chapters 3. It is developed in chapter 4. It's dropped, you see, at the second half of 1 and the beginning of 2. It's not even in there. Chapter 3, we're not talking about the new high priest at all. Chapter 5, there's no new high priest. But then we get to chapter 6, and we see the purple, and we know that theme is being reinforced. And even more development, a little break in chapter 8, and then second half of 8 going all the way through second half of 10, that baby is reinforced all the way. It's mentioned one final time in chapter 13 as a final reinforcement. So the breakdown graphically, some people appreciate a chart like that, some people don't. But nonetheless, you can graphically see how the book is laid out, its important areas, how they overlap. I like to see how he is, remember the guy on Ed Sullivan years ago who had the plates that he'd start spinning one plate, and then a second plate, he's spinning two plates, he puts another one here, and he's spinning all these plates at the same time. Remember this? Or am I the only person who remembers Ed Sullivan? All right. It's a really big show here. But yes, so you can see in some chapters, they are chock full as opposed to 11 and 12. It's really one-trick ponies. And see, he's got a lot of plates, especially in the centerpiece of the book. By the time he gets second half of chapter 2 all the way through the second half of chapter 10, he's continually balancing multiple plates. And maybe he'd let one plate down that he'd introduced. You can't keep 7 themes all spinning at the same time, and they're in various, it's like Thanksgiving dinner, okay? Maybe you'll remember that, okay, instead of Ed Sullivan, okay? And you have the turkey, that's like the main theme, okay? That's like the red at the bottom, okay? The turkey's gonna take the longest, okay? But then you've got all these, and of course, I'm speaking theoretically because I've never made a turkey or been involved in the cooking of Thanksgiving, as my wife could attest. But I've been involved in the eating, so I have some, when is it gonna be done? And so I know from whence I speak regarding the complication of here's the vegetables and here's the potatoes and here's all these other things, and they all take different times. This side dish takes longer to cook than this side dish, and you have to balance it all so that everything is ready to go when the turkey is ready to be served, whatever that may be. Same thing with the book of Hebrews. So, all right, well, let's stop there. What I want to talk about next week is the theology of the book of Hebrews, and we'll get right into the text itself, Lord willing, if he doesn't come for us between now and then.